share some things that can happen in a page. I said click on a button, right click on a button. Mushtaq said on click, save input data and display what was inserted. So save input data on click and display what was inserted. I sort of understand that. So you have an input field, and on click of the input field, you kind of display that somehow. Yep, that could be something that someone does.
Yeah, that's the one.
But no one else wrote anything. But there are all sorts of things that users can do on a page. So I want you, in fact, there might be, what are possible user interactions? Oh, look, I left it in from the previous one. The preview, look, we're going to do it ourselves. Oh, spoilers. We're going to fill that page out later. We're going to collaboratively think of some events we can do. Anyway, events are triggered by interactions, usually interactions from our user. So users navigate around our pages, they click on stuff, they do a bunch of things with files or with their keyboard or whatever. And those are triggering lots of events in our pages. We can tell the browser that when a user triggers an event, it can actually run a function. So we listen for events, terminology, we listen for events, and then when that event is fired or triggered, we handle that event. So we listen for events, we use handlers to handle when the event is triggered or fired, and so there's sort of a few bits of terminology to remember, but events and event handlers they can be fairly confusing. I think really the part that is most confusing is that they use callbacks, which I know Vasil spoke to you about a couple of weeks ago or last week. Callbacks are confusing, and I think really that's the tricky part about using events. It's not necessarily the event listening and handling and triggering and so on. It's just the concept of a callback, really. Okay, now that page that just had some spoilers from the previous cohort, I now want to write down loads of things that can happen on a page. So I've already got a couple. Click on a button and double click on a button, and who was it? Mushtaq said say on click save input data, so click on input field and then display what was inserted, save input data. Yeah, those probably aren't events, probably aren't things that people do. That would be, this is all triggered by just clicking on an input field, and then the rest of those sort of chain of actions, that's all in your code. So clicking on the input field, that can be our user interaction. What else can people do?
They can hover on mouse over.
Yeah, we can hover. And so far we've specified elements. We can click on a button, double click on a button, click on an input field. You didn't specify an element, and you're right not to. In fact, all of these, they can be triggered on any element. Just because a button or an A tag, just because those are often things that users click on, doesn't mean you can't click on all sorts of elements. So the click on the input field actually just is part of the click. And so we can click on something, we can double click on something, we can hover over something. What else could we do?
is the sending data like email inserted and sent email? Would that be different or?
What do you mean? Sorry. What does the user do to the page to do what you're describing?
So we have a like input field which has some text or whatever, and you want to email to someone by clicking.
You want to. So when you click on the button, you send. It's like a contact us form, and they fill out the form,
Yeah.
and that gets sent as an email. So there is a user interaction there. What actually is the user interaction that then later on will trigger an email to be sent?
The button click.
The button click, and in this case, contact us. Epic Game. Oh, okay. So contact form. No, contact us form. I just want to see. Okay, yeah, that'll do. An image will do. So we have. It's annoying that Google doesn't open the images these days. Okay, we have a contact us form. I type in my email, I type in my message, and then I click on this submit button. So Daniel correctly said that the user interaction there, that one of the key user interactions is clicking on the button. But what is that button click actually doing?
Submitting the form?
Submitting the form. Perfect. Who was that? Theodora? Yes, I think so. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So clicking on the button is kind of how the user triggers the submit event. But actually, you could hit enter. You could, I don't know, you could kind of, I think if you had more than one button, you could use more than one button to submit the form. But really, the important one there is actually submitting a form. That's a whole separate event because it can be triggered in multiple different ways. So forms have their own types of events as well. What else are we doing when we're filling out this form?
We can change user input fields with upper case letters or lower case letters.
Exactly.
Something like that.
Exactly. So we can change the value of input fields. So not last week, on Tuesday, I set up a set interval to kind of keep looking every half a second, keep looking at an input field and get the current value of it. We can now listen for the event of when the user actually changes the value. So as soon as the user changes the value, we get notified, okay, the user's just changed something. So then we can do whatever we want in real time. That's how we'd check for the validation in real time of this email. Really the same thing for the drop-down field. So this is a drop-down or a select tag. So you click on the select tag, you choose an option in the select tag, but actually that just changes the value of the input field. So it's really the same event going on there. Okay, let's look at this page. There's an excellent example. What am I doing now?
Scrolling.
I'm scrolling. So this little scroll bar that lots of websites like this quite like, but I don't like it. I don't see the point really. But this bar will be kind of listening for when the user scrolls, and every time they scroll, it updates the size of the bar based on the current scroll height. So we can scroll the page. So some events only fire on the whole page. Other events fire on individual elements. So what am I doing now?
We can hide any information probably.
We can
from the
hide.
user, like passwords or.
Okay.
Not passwords, but for example, if we create a form, and after the user fill that form, we can hide it from the page or something like that.
Okay.
Or a button or any kind of element.
Or a button. So hiding. Well, if we kind of think backwards, really, if we want to do that, the interaction that happens is probably submitting a form or clicking on a little drop down thing to show and hide it or whatever. But visibility is a good one. So I've just changed tab. That is actually a user interaction. I've just hidden the other tab, and now I'm going to show this tab. So the event is visibility change, but kind of tab focus changes. That makes a little bit more sense. And similarly to this, element focus changes. So by hitting tab, we can tab through focusing on the various elements in the page. You might just think about clicking on a text field and you want to do something when the user clicks on that text field, but actually they may not click on the text field. They may in fact tab to focus on the text field. So this is referring to the current element that is focused, and you get focus and you lose focus. So tab focus changes is when we switch tabs. Element focus changes is when we are focused on a particular element. What else can we do that is obvious? I can't quite think of any other obvious ones, but there are loads of events, and all of these are pretty desktop centric. They are assuming you're using a computer with a mouse and a keyboard. There's one that we haven't talked about. Key presses, so we can just listen even if the user isn't focused on an input field. We can listen for whenever they press a key. I think we can listen for something like pasting or copying or pasting. But still, this is all assuming that it's a desktop device. But on mobile, and actually kind of on desktop, but most of these are a bit more applicable to mobile, you can listen for orientation change. So if the user is looking in portrait and you have a website that this is very often in games, if a game is landscape, and so you can show a big message saying please rotate your phone to landscape, and then you kind of listen for the event, the orientation change event, when they turn their phone, the browser rotates around, the orientation change event will fire, and you can then hide that message and they can continue to play the game. compass. What's the terminology? I can't quite remember. But compass heading. So in your phones have all sorts of sensors in these days. You can get the current direction. You have to kind of request access from the user. You can get the current direction that the user is facing based on the compass heading of their device. You can get that just in a browser. Similarly, like accelerometer, meter, that'll do. Stuff like one is battery status. So if the battery starts, if you say, I don't know, this game will use lots of your battery, please start charging, so they plug in, you can listen for an event that they've just plugged in, I think. The light sensor, I think, is another event or another thing that can emit events. So on phones and on quite a lot of laptops these days, there's a light sensor that will kind of change the brightness of your screen automatically, so you could be listening for changes in the light sensor, and if it dims particularly low, you could switch to dark mode or something like that. But there are absolutely loads. So events, MDN, event reference. Yeah, here we go. Okay, so most common categories: resource events, network events, focus events, WebSocket events, session history, CSS animation, form, printing, text composition. These are just the most common events, and then all the way down here are the less common events. So, okay, and then it kind of repeats itself. There are loads. So resource events, that is kind of when you are trying to download a file or something from another website. You get events that fire on that particular resource. Network events, so if you know the Chrome dinosaur, do you all know that that's a game as well? I assume you've seen the Chrome dinosaur, but if you press spacebar on the Chrome dinosaur page, it like turns into a game. It starts jumping over like cacti and stuff. It's a fun game. But I think you may have also noticed that page like automatically refreshes as soon as you get a connection back. So that page is listening for the online event, and when it receives the online event, it will reload the page for you. And that, I think that's only been around for sort of 2 or 3 years. Before that, you'd have to reload the page, but Chrome or Google or whoever clearly decided that anyone who is looking at that page, as soon as they get a network connection, they're going to want to reload the page. So they just decided to do that for you. Focus, we talked about this. This is elements that receive focus. Blur is the opposite of focusing. WebSockets, we'll talk about WebSockets in module 3, but WebSockets are a different way to have communication between a front end and a back end, essentially. They allow for real-time applications like chat and stuff. Session history, page hide. So that's when you navigate away from a page. If you close it, possibly, or if you click on a link that takes you to a different page. A session history entry, or maybe it's only when you use the back and forward buttons in the browser. CSS animation events, so these are fired. I don't know what they'll fire on. I suppose they'll fire on an element that then has a CSS animation applied to it. Transition, like I've never really needed to use these, but they're pretty useful if you do need them. Form, you're going to be sick of submitting forms. This submit, that absolutely is an incredibly common one. You're going to use that a lot. Printing, who prints anything these days? Text composition. The composition of a passage of text is prepared but works with other inputs. Meh. Okay. Yeah, again, never needed that, but that's quite handy, I suppose. Anyway, there are loads. Far too many to go through, far too many to use in practice. But it's about the concept of kind of listening for something, waiting for something to happen, and then running some code. Does anyone have any kind of ideas of user interactions now we've looked at that, now we've talked about this, that you think is that something we could listen for in the browser? Like where you can have touch events, so you can have multi-touch. If you've got 4 fingers on the screen, you can listen for all of those. What else can you do? Don't know. Maybe, what about like the flashlight? Do you reckon there's an event for turning the flashlight on? Light. Oh, there's not even the light sensor. Okay, device motion, device orientation, and orientation change. Proximity sensor. What? Is that the thing on the phone that when it is close to your ear, it turns the screen off so you don't automatically touch the screen with your face or your ear? Could be that. That's quite interesting that you can get that. Or maybe it's an NFC.
That sometimes is very, very annoying as well.
It can be, yeah, if your hand is too close. Anyway, loads and loads of events. It's really, I'd like to kind of frame it as way more than just clicking and submitting, but ultimately that's the majority of what you're going to be doing. Okay, to add an event listener, funnily enough, we call a function called add event listener. It's a function that's available to us on a page element, and it takes 2 arguments. Actually, it takes more than 2, but the vast majority of the time you're only going to use 2. The first argument is the type of event. So all of those like phrases that we were just looking at on the MDN page, those are all strings, those are all types of events that you pass to add event listener. The second argument that you pass is a function. So here is where it does get a little bit confusing when you're still learning about functions and callbacks and things like that. But the second argument is a function to handle when the event is triggered. So we found our event in the page, or maybe we've created it. Our element in the page, or maybe we've created it. We call the function add event listener on the element. We pass a string that says click. We want to listen for when the user clicks on this element. And we pass it a function that describes what we want to happen when the user clicks on the element. Of course, we're using an arrow function here. if it's just a one-liner, we don't need these curly brackets, but in this case, I mean, it's a sort of zero-liner, so in fact we do need curly brackets. So type of event, and then what you want to happen. Oh dear. I think I also gave up. I gave up having my camera on with the previous cohort because I found no one else puts their camera on. But I think I'm going to stick with it for you guys. So sorry about that. You have to see me yawn. And I will probably forget that I did once realise that I had my camera on and I was wearing shorts, and I like put my leg on the chair, and then I realised, oh, you can see my bare leg. That's weird. But anyway, so here we're finding a button element. Using query selector, we're finding the first button element in the page. Then we add an event listener to that button element on the click event. When the user clicks on the button, run the function, and we're just going to log out the button was clicked. Now, this function can optionally, in JavaScript, everything's kind of optional, can optionally receive an argument, which is an event object. And we'll look at that in a bit more detail when we are trying it out in the browser. I'm writing event here. I've got event in this one and an event in this one. But in both of those examples, we aren't actually using the event object inside the function. We're not doing anything with it. So, because it's optional, we don't really need to specify that argument. We can just have open and close brackets. So that's an important thing. If you're using the event, you need it. If you're not, you don't actually need it there. For you guys, it's probably best to always write that event argument there, because if you need it, then fine. If you don't need it, then it doesn't really matter that it's there. It will still work and be fine. So it's kind of easier to just have it there unused, as opposed to sometimes not using it and then deciding you want to use it and then forgetting to add it at the top of your function, which is a pretty common thing. Okay, whereas this one, so slightly different. Whereas the previous slide we are clicking on a button, this one we're clicking on a header, an H1. So that is a demonstration of the fact that you can click on any element. It doesn't matter if it is typically something a user might want to click on. So we add our click event listener to the header element. We have this function to handle when the event is triggered. It logs out that header was clicked, and it logs out event.target. Can anyone guess what event.target might be referring to?
The header?
Mm-hmm.
The H1? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. It's the element on which the event was triggered. In this case, it's probably, not necessarily, it's probably the header element. We're saying on this header element, when the user clicks on something, tell me which element the user just clicked on. So it's a bit sort of roundabout. We can assume the user is probably clicking directly on this header element. It's not strictly true, and I'll go into why later. But yeah, Dan, you're absolutely right. It's probably that header element. Okay, let's go to the code editor and build a page with a bunch of things in it. Okay, so effects, code events. I might nick the page from the other day. I think that was quite good to just have a load of content already made. So this and this, no, this and this and this. Okay. So, quick recap of, in fact, we can now, oh, it's a broken button. We can now add the functionality to get rid of this cookies message. So, let's do it. What's just happened there? Never mind. So, we want to find that button. It has a class of button accept all, CC button accept all. Let's go with that. So we want to document query selector class of button accept all. Good. We do get that button or that A tag. Accept button is this, and then accept button dot add event listener, click console dot log accepted. So an arrow function, an inline arrow function. Because it's one line, we don't need the curly brackets. We aren't using the event, so I haven't specified event. I just have the empty parentheses to say that it is a function. It just doesn't receive any arguments. I'm adding the event listener to the accept button, and this is my event handler. So hit enter. Might be a bit funky because of the fact that this has a sort of target on it already, so I don't really know what it's going to do. It's okay, it opens it in a new tab, but it is actually logging out accepted. So every time I click, there's 3 now, there'll be 4. Okay, it's opening the website with hash null on there in a new tab, but this event handler is still firing. So next we can find the message. So banner wrapper, do we think that's it? Banner wrapper, okay. So cookie message is document.add event, no, not add event listener, query selector, and we find the element with the class CC banner wrapper, cookie message, that's worked. Now on our accepted button, instead of logging out accepted, we actually want to say cookie message dot remove. Now when I click on this, it still opens it in a new tab. However, that message is no longer there. That's not the best way to demonstrate, so I'll kind of do all of this again, and I will remove that that href and the blank and stuff, because it's just a bit confusing. And then I'll add it in and show you something later on. Okay. Cookie, this one, we don't want anything. What happens if I just do that? Okay. What? Oh, there's some sneaky JavaScript going on, I think. Oh, I'm clicking on doing more info, not the close button. Where's the close button? CC accept. It's easier to find it in JavaScript. CC accept. Accept all, got it. There we go. It's probably going to look awful now. Okay. Nearly there. Href none. Done. Okay, excellent. So it doesn't have an href target to open or to navigate to, so we can instantly see when I click on it, it removes that message. It also logs out accepted in the console. That's one thing about add event listener. Every time we call it, we're adding a new function to be called when the user clicks. So if I do that a whole bunch of times, as soon as I click, it's going to log out accepted 10 times, and once it's going to remove the cookie message from the page. So bear that in mind. I think later on in the lesson we talk about how to remove those, but it's not that often that you have to remove them. Okay, so we're listening for a click on that cookie message. We're dismissing it. Now let's look at this element. Let's do kind of the same thing that I did on Tuesday. So we want limit input. Limit input is document query selector with the ID limit input. Then limit input dot add event listener. Now, what do you think would be an appropriate event type string to use when the value of the input field changes? Does anyone have an idea of what would you expect that to be? No one's coming up with anything. Okay, so I sort of expect it to be change. So when that value changes, so when the user types something in, it in fact isn't. So if I do change console.log lim input.value, let's see what the value of that input field is every time there is a change event that fires on here. Reload that. I'm typing in a bunch of stuff. There's nothing in my console. Why not? Now there's something in my console. I just clicked in my console. There's something in there. 1, 2, 3. Click away from it, so actually blur. I lose focus of that element. So what the change event is for is when the user, and I think the MDN documentation uses the term commit, a bit like Git, you're committing to a change. That's kind of where it's used. But I don't like that, and in fact the developers of React also don't like that. So it gets a little bit confusing once you guys will learn React and then kind of go back and do vanilla JavaScript events like we are now, I always do change first, but actually it's input. So the event to listen for when the value changes on an input field is input. Like the input event is firing every single time the value changes. So 1, 2, 3, every time I type something, it logs something out. Every time something changes, I delete everything, it logs an empty string. So that's one thing. I mean, now you'll probably just think, okay, that's what it is. But later on, when you use other libraries that kind of change the terminology a little bit to suit what, in my opinion, to suit what makes sense, change makes sense. It's sometimes tricky to kind of go back and use the native events. But we are getting the value from that limit input every single time we change our value. What about all the inputs? So all the inputs. Document query selector, all elements with the input tag. So let's just log that out to see how many we've got. We've got 11. We've got 11 different input fields on this page. What we could do, all the inputs dot for each input field, for each individual input field, we can add an event listener, console.log input field dot value. I actually was trying to go for something else, but realized that what I was trying to demonstrate is not actually an issue if we're doing it like this, but I'll show you in a bit anyway. Okay, so this, I'm pretty sure, is going to be an input field. No, that's a select tag, isn't it? This is going to be an input field. Okay, so I've clicked on that. The value of that input field is other. In fact, we can see it is a value attribute on the radio button of the string other. I choose this one, the value of that is Latin. This one, the value of that is plain, value of that is HTML, value of this one is the same nonsense that I typed in earlier. Okay, that one doesn't work because it's a select tag, not an input field, whereas these do work. The checkbox also works. Every time the value of that checkbox is checked, it's going to be logged out. The value of it is actually marks. We'll kind of come on to that another time. This, I think, is a text area, so probably isn't going to be an input field. What else have we got? Have we got anything down here? No, I think that's pretty much everything. But we've added an event listener, or we've added 10 event listeners, 11 event listeners to each individual, one to each of the 11 input fields. So every time we're running this code, we're creating a new function here to be used as an event handler when the event fires on the input field. So what I wanted to demonstrate, but actually is a bit stupid because we have access to this input field, is using the event argument that we get passed in. So event.target, as we saw in the slides, is the element that triggered the event. So I click on that, it gives me that element. I click on the checkbox, it gives me that element. Event.target.value gives me the exact same stuff that I was just looking at using input field dot value. But you may not have access to the input field or the element here. It's always much better practice to access stuff from arguments that are being passed to your function. So yes, in this case, we can actually just go out of our handler function into the for each iterator function and get access to the input field element, but it's always better practice to do it this way and use the event. And I will show you why, in fact. Okay, so I just said that it's making a new function for every single event, every single element in that array. It's not the biggest overhead in the world. It's not going to slow your site down massively, but that's not great. You're creating a brand new function every single time. If you want to only use one, we can have a function handle input click. It should be descriptive. Console log event.target.value. So this one function is going to be used for all the input fields. So on click of each input field, we pass it a reference to that function. So we don't call the function like that. You don't want to do that. You want the user to be calling your function, kind of. So when the user clicks on this element, use this function. It's kind of like copying and pasting that function in place as an inline function. One benefit is that it makes this much more readable. It's really nice. So for each input field handle click, that's not very descriptive, but I don't know, may like remove field, or you might want to do something, and it reads quite nicely. So that's where we would have to use event target value, because inside here we don't have access to input field because it's not being passed to this function. Only the event is being passed to this function. And let's have a look. Plain HTML. Okay, it's slightly confusing, but every time I click on that, that's logging out. I'm going to type something, and then that logs out. I click on it again, that logs out. Kind of confusing. Okay. Let's go back to the slides, and we can return and add all sorts to this page later on. Okay. I did more than I had intended to. So, the input event, you find your input field, you listen for the input event firing on the input field, and here we're going to log out the value of the input field. And it's almost like I wrote these slides. And it's better practice, rather than going outside of this function to this input field, it's better practice to access the event object, access the target of the event, access the value of that target. So event.target.value is something that you'll probably get used to writing quite often, but actually it's just the same as this. You find an input field, get the value of it. Event.target is just one of those input fields. So going sort of 2 levels deep, if you're still kind of slightly confused about objects and accessing properties and things, it feels sort of more significant, but it's not. It's no different to just accessing the value of this input field. Okay, no, I'm not going to do that yet. Okay, this is a good one. So event.target.name. input fields should, especially in a form, should have names, have name attributes. So your HTML has a opening square bracket, opening angle bracket, input, it's got an ID maybe, it's got a class. It should also have a name attribute to specify the kind of the data, usually the data in a database that this input field is referring to. We can use that name to set a key on an object that represents that form data in a JavaScript object. So, name field, add event listener, input, handle change. So on a field for the user's name, whenever it changes, so on the event, on the input event, call the function handle change. So the user or the browser is going to call our function handle change, and it's going to call the exact same function on the age field. Then it's going to call the exact same function on the comment field. So these are three different fields. One is a type text, one is a type number, one is a type, I don't know, text again, I guess. They're all different, they're all used for different things, but we're going to use the same function for all three. Events bubble up, I think, okay, that, oh yeah, okay. I'm going to demonstrate this before we talk about events bubbling up. So, have we got a form on this page? Query selector form. Where is it? Right at the top. I don't really like this form. I don't understand it. So I think I'm going to create a new form. Main row 0 field set ID form generator. Sorry, this generator needs. Okay. So we're going to have label name, the input type text, and the name of the input field is going to be first name. We are going to have the same age, whereas this is going to be a number, name, age, and we had comment. Could we have something else? We can have phone number, type is number, phone, or we can have password. Yeah, it's a different input type, isn't it? Password. And the name of the input field is also going to be password. Let's have a look at what that looks like. That's not the worst thing in the world. We now have an input with the type submit. That's how we get a submit button in our form. So we have name, first name, name, age, and name, password. We can use query selector. Name input is document.query selector input, where name of the input field, which is slightly confusing, is name. We can do age. Oh no, I did first name. Yeah, I did it first name to be less confusing, but I just confused myself. So now we have password. So we've got these three. Okay, let's reload the page, make sure that's worked. Name, input, that looks good. Age, input, good. Password, input, Good. Now, handle change is going to be one function that we use, something changed. And on name input, add event listener input, the handler is going to be handle change. And we do the same thing for our age input, the same thing for our password input. So we've got 3 input fields. We've created one function, and we're using that one function for all 3 different input fields. So I can type in my name here, Sam, age 29, something change. We can see actually we're getting the input value because of that sort of event listener that's been added to all elements, all input elements on the page. But we're also getting something changed because it's been added to just these 3 input fields. So Sam's password, you can see, because we've used the type password, we can't see it, but we do have the value of Sam's password in that input field. So now we want to know which element has actually changed. So we can log out the event. And in this case, it is an input event. Data is M. Okay, data, I guess, is the last thing that kind of caused this particular change. So I typed in Sam, S-A-M. So this one, data, is going to be A. Okay, that's interesting. I don't think I've used that on an input event. The path, the target really is probably in this case all we want to know about here, but there's our target. The target has a value somewhere down here. Value is Sam, and the name F-M-N, the name of that input field is first name. So event.target is the input field, event.target.name is the type of data that just changed. So Sam, something changed, first name, age 29, age changed, Sam's password just changed. The password has just changed. Now, if we use event.target.value, which we have just learnt about, Sam, now we're seeing first name is Sam, age is 29, password is Sam's password. These are quite often key value pairs on an object. So let's say user data is an object. It can just be a completely empty object. Something changed, we're going to log out user data, but before we log it out, we're going to say user data, we're going to access a key dynamically because event.target.name is just a string, and remember from a couple of weeks ago, we can access keys on an object using strings. Event.target.name is the key, and event.target.value is the value on this object. So we're creating an empty object. Every time the user changes the values in their input fields, we're going to set the key at event.target.name to the value of the input field. And then we're going to log it out, so we'll see what that does. Sam 29, Sam's password. So we are dynamically constructing an object based on the names of all the input fields and then the values of those input fields that the user has typed in. The benefit of doing it like this, instead of having one function to handle the name, one function to handle the age, one function to handle the password, is it's much easier to say password confirmation, password there, password confirmation. It's much easier now to say Sam X29 password. It's not yet adding it to this object, but we will. Yeah, I know. I guess let's follow through with this bit. So password confirmation input, password confirmation, and password confirmation. So that's done. That's pretty easy. So now we're dynamically adding password confirmation as well. Fairly straightforward, but there is another feature of events that we can exploit to make it even easier and even more flexible. And that is that events bubble up. So when I said, when Daniel said that when we clicked on the header, event.target is the header, I said probably, but not necessarily. If we add an event listener to the header element, and inside the header element there is a button or a div or any other element, if we click on that element, the event is going to kind of traverse up the DOM tree, and every event in every element in the hierarchy that contains this element is going to have the event fired on it. So we click on the button that's inside the header, and the button has that event that's fired. Maybe we aren't listening for an event on there, but then it moves up to the parent of that element, which is the header. We are listening for the event on the header, and it triggers that event handler, and then it moves up to the body, maybe the body of the document, and then it moves up to the document itself. So when you're listening for events and you're setting up certainly input field handlers, we can exploit this fact. All of our input elements are inside one common element, and that's the form. Okay, I was expecting there to be a code. We can add the input event handler to the form element, so we don't need to access all of these individually. So we just get the form. So let's get that first form: user data, handle change, event target name, event target value, all of this, and we just add it to the form. Now, not that one, now it's triggering on this input field, which is actually wrapped in a label, so it triggers on the label, but we don't care, we're not listening. And then it triggers on the form, and we are listening on the form. So I type in all of these, password and password confirmation, and it's dynamically creating an object that represents the user's data based on the names of the input fields and the corresponding values. So now, if we wanted to add hair color. Hair color. And someone once told me I'm blonde, and I got very offended. I'm still offended, really. So Sam 29 hair color. It's definitely brown. It's a solid brown, I think. Password. Now that's all we had to do. We just actually had to add a new input field to the form. The events that trigger on the input field bubble up to that form element, and now we have hair color definitely brown in this user data object. So that's something that with forms, certainly this exact scenario you'll probably do pretty regularly. It's not that common that you use this sort of bubbling up feature, but I think it's one of the most important things to know, because when you can use it like this, it just makes your life a lot easier. And actually the document, so just like where we were saying document, query selector document, create element, the document is an element in itself that contains all other elements. So document.add event listener, click event.target. We're going to log out the target of the event when the click event is fired on the document, which actually means we're going to log something out when anything is clicked on, because everything, okay, don't really want to do that, no, everything is housed inside the document, so everything we click on, it gets logged out. And I think there was, I don't think this will work actually, but there was some kind of way, JS listen for all events. I did this not too long ago actually. Weird on key on. Okay, interesting. Yeah, it's a bit unnecessary, but it's I quite like that. So what is going on there? Object.keys window. I can't remember if you've been introduced to object.keys yet, but object.keys takes an object and gives you an array of all of the keys on that object. So let's just look, let's do this again. Let's just look at what object.keys is. So there's 232 keys on the window object. So window, let's look at the window object. We've got all of these keys. This is them in an array, so there's quite a lot of them. But another way to listen for events is actually using on, so on click, on input, on focus. I don't tend to like it quite as much, but it's another way of doing it. So what that little snippet is doing is, let's copy it again, getting all of those keys, iterating over all of the keys. It's saying, basically, if it starts with on, then if the key starts with on, then we're going to assume it's an event that we can listen for, And so we call the function window.addEventListener key slice to, so take the key that is on click and slice off the first two characters, so on click becomes click, listen for the click event and just log out that event. So you can see nope, now you can see, okay, it's immediately run a device orientation event. Why? But I'm moving my mouse, it actually seems to be logging out like 4 different events: a mouse event, a pointer event, and a mouse event. Or maybe that's just 2. No, there's definitely more than 2 going on there. If I click, there was a slightly different one. Oh, yeah, loads of mouse moves. So focus event, a select start event just triggered. So there's absolutely loads of events that are firing all the time. You can see, yeah, again in DevTools, I've used this very occasionally. It's kind of interesting, but not super useful. You can click on an element and find and view the event listeners that are applied to that particular element. So on that input field, directly on the input field, we have the click event and the input event that I set up earlier, but then we can actually show listeners on all the ancestors of that element, in which case we have this wildcard which doesn't actually do anything. We have load, which I don't think I'm adding, but something somewhere is adding it. And we've got 2 click events or just 1. I don't know. It's kind of interesting, but I don't think that's super useful, really. Okay, and now after running that little bit of code, you can see all of those events that are added. Okay. So events bubble up. If you do want to listen for events, kind of global events, you can listen to them on the window or the document, and any event that you trigger on any elements in the page, they are going to bubble all the way up to the document and trigger your function. Okay, any questions on click or input events before we learn about submitting that form?
I think Mushtaq put one in the chat.
Sorry. What will be real world web dev example of event bubble up? So the form one is a good example. I certainly use that all the time. If you had, so all of these buttons, which are kind of 6 different buttons within one parent element, I think. Yeah, they're all in this nav element. Why is there an iframe? They're all in this UL element, in fact. If you wanted something to happen when, like, I click on this button and I want to change the language to Chinese, I mean, we can do this. So language selection buttons. Language selection container. Container is document. Query selector nav lang. Let's see that worked. Language selection container, good. Then on language selection container, add event listener, click, event, console log, event. So when I click on ZH, it's going to log something out. And it does, but because I'm clicking on a link, I actually don't see it for very long. So if we do want to see it, you can check preserve log. So down here in the console drawer, you can go to console settings and preserve log. Usually the log gets cleared when you navigate to a different page, but in this case, I want to keep the log around because we're clicking on something to navigate to a different page. So now we can see that the mouse event has logged out, but this kind of okay, and then so I don't know, we have a function set lang code and console log language set to lang code. There we go. And then we can call set lang, and in fact we're going to have to call event.target.inner text, I think. DE language set to DE, ZH language set to ZH. But that's a pretty bad user experience because we're navigating away to a separate page when actually we want to kind of dynamically change the language using JavaScript. We could swap out the language file being used or whatever. So we don't want the page to navigate away when we click on these links. Ukrainian? Right, yeah, Ukrainian. EN is English. UK, I thought UK is not a language. So, when you click on a link, the default behavior of clicking on a link is to go to that link, is to either open in a new tab or just navigate to that URL in the current tab. If we don't want the default behavior to happen, we can run a function that is given to us on that event. So let's have a look at all of the things available to us. Here's one. Default prevented. So that's saying, has the default behavior been prevented? Currently it's false, and then it navigated away to a different page. If we look down here, or in UI event, no, just in event. Here we go. So, all events have, not all events necessarily have default behaviors, but all events have this function just in case you do want to prevent the default behavior. So, on our event, we can call the function event.preventDefault. So we just call that function, we don't pass it any arguments, and then from then on, that event, the default behavior that it does have, it won't actually do that. So now we can reload the page. I don't want to preserve the log anymore. Every time we click, let's not log out the event and actually spell this correctly. Set lang to ZH UK RUEN etc. So now we can use some JavaScript. We could, I don't know, call the Google Translate API and get all the text, and then come back and swap the text out if we wanted to. That might be quite a good exercise, actually. Yeah, building the translate feature. Anyway, so that's where event prevent default comes into play, and that is certainly a real world example of events, of using the fact that events bubble up. We have a bunch of things that we want to do the same thing for, so we add the event listener on the parent object. Okay, let's move on. I think we're going to move on to talking about prevent default. So we'll double down on it. So here we are going to listen for a submit event on the form. We find the form in the page, we add an event listener for the submit event, and then when that event gets triggered, we're going to run this event handler. And it just logs out submit the data. But as we just learned, some interactions have default behaviors. Here's clicking on an A tag opens the link. That's what we just saw. But a couple of other examples: submitting a form reloads the page. It's not really true, and when you learn a bit more about requests and servers and things, we can talk about why a form appears to reload a page. And I'll show you what it does in a bit. Another example: clicking on a checkbox toggles the checkbox. So every time we click on it, it toggles from true to false. These are all default behaviors that users generally want to happen. Even reloading the page. Generally, the way you set up a form, you actually kind of, depending on how your website is built, you do want it to do that. So sometimes we don't want that to happen. As we just saw, we call the function prevent default that is on the event itself. So our form, when we submit it, we don't want it to reload the page. We are going to handle the data ourselves. We're going to send it to a server. The server's going to send us back something, and then we're going to display a success message to the user. But in the meantime, we don't want to navigate away to a different page, so we call event prevent default. So let's try that out. We've already got this form. So form.add event listener submit console log event.target. Let's see what triggered that event. We've got our form at the top. I'm going to click submit, and it kind of reloads the page. It's not a great example because it's a pretty fast page to load, but if I throttle the network, if I pretend it's on slow 3G, we hit submit, okay, still very fast. That clearly doesn't work like that when we're serving it as a file. Never mind. Trust me, it is reloading the page. But we don't want that to happen. We want to do some stuff, do some data, and then hit submit. And we want to kind of display that data on the page somehow. We don't want to lose all of our progress. So we call event.prevent default. So we have a bunch of data. We hit submit. Okay, I have to enter a number. Now we're not losing our progress. We're not navigating away anywhere. We are staying on this page, and we can do something with that user data. So we don't really care about when it's changed. We only care about when it's finished. So Sam 10 blah blah blah. Hit submit, and we have our sort of constructed, finished user data object. We could have a function send user data to the server. User data. In here, we could set timeout. It's going to take a second to do something, and that thing might be new element is document.create element. Let's just have a div. New element dot inner text is JSON.stringify user data, then document.body.prepend, so that's something before the first child. Opposite of append, adds it at the beginning of the element, so document body prepend, new element. So we're going to call send user data to server. We pass it the user data object. It is sort of simulating a request that takes 1 second. We send it to the server processes it and takes 1 second, then it comes back. So blah blah blah. Okay. 10. There. It took 1 second, and then added that to the page. I'm going to say brown. I'm going to click now. It took 1 second, and it keeps adding new fields, new elements with our data into the page. So I feel like I said I was going to show you something else in this bit, but I've forgotten. Back to the slides. Yeah, I'm sure I was going to say something else. Anyway, any questions on submitting forms or prevent default or anything like that? Nothing. Okay, what's next? Remove event listener. So like I showed you at the beginning of this, every time we call add event listener, it's, funnily enough, adding an event listener, and they're always there. They're not actually being removed until we call remove event listener. Remove event listener takes 2 arguments, just like add. It takes an event type, just like add, and a function, just like add. A problem with remove event listener is that you need to reference the same function that you used when you called add event listener. Now, most of the examples in my code that I've written now, that's just not possible, because we've written inline anonymous functions. So, exactly. Oh, look at that. So, on an element, add event listener, click. We have our inline anonymous function that we just write and create in here as an argument, as a callback to pass to the add event listener function. When that happens, we only want to do something once. So we log out, do something once. Then we call remove event listener. Remove the event listener that is listening for a click. But which function we don't have a word or a name to refer to this function because we've just created it as an inline anonymous function, hence why it's called an anonymous function. So we can't actually do it like this. So we need to do a little bit of a refactor to have element add event listener click, and we pass it the name of this variable which is referring to this function. So in here it says do it once, and then now a bit unnecessary, but in this case handle event, it's actually going to happen every single time, but now we change it to handle event once, and it is going to log out, do it once, and then remove itself, remove the function with the name handle event once. So let's try remove event listener. What might we only want to do once? I suppose we could do the language thing. So here's a perfect example. We don't have a name to refer to this function. So what we could do, what you might think we could do, is language selection container, remove event listener, click, and then just paste in the same code. But in fact, it's already not the same code, because in this one we have the call to remove event listener, which then has a new function. Even if that wasn't in there, like this, I guess, this function and this function, to our eyes, they're the same function, but they are two separate values. They're two separate pieces of information to the computer. We create a new function with no name here, and then we create another new function with no name here. Therefore, so handle language click is going to be that function. We say handle language click, and we are going to remove it inside the handle language click function. So we add an event listener to listen for the click, we run it once, and then we remove it. So in fact, that's going to lead to some slightly interesting behavior where I can click on ZH to set the language to Chinese, and then it's actually removed the event listener and therefore removed the prevent default call. Therefore, I can click on Ukrainian, and it's actually now not triggering that event handler, not calling prevent default, and it is actually navigating away to the Ukrainian site. I did remove event listener. I certainly did it sort of recently in the last couple of months. Can't quite remember. Oh yeah. So in a game that has levels, so you kind of enter level 1, then we start listening for like key presses, and then you finish that level, and in the time between finishing that level and kind of entering the next level, we don't want the user to be able to do anything, so we remove all the event listeners at the end of the level, and then add them again at the start of the next level. So there's an example of removing event listeners that I've actually done recently. It's like I said earlier, you're going to be adding event listeners much more often than you are going to be removing them, but it's still pretty useful to know about. Okay, and then last we're going to do on. Any questions about removing event listeners? Doesn't look like it. Okay. So, I've already said it's not the only way to add event listeners. We can have on functions. So, elements have this sort of built-in behavior that if there is a function that has been set to the key called onClick on an element, then it will run that function when the user clicks on the element, when that click event is triggered or that submit event is triggered or whatever. So it's slightly easier. What's this? Pro, yeah. Because you set onClick to be this function. If we say, what have we got? Form.onClick is that function, and then form.onClick is that function, and then it's that, and then that. There's actually only ever going to be one. In fact, when the page loads, it's going to be this one. It's going to be the last one. We keep overwriting the previous onClick function. So that's kind of a pro. There's always only ever one. But I think, yeah, it's actually also a con, because sometimes you do want multiple. As we just saw, because, I don't know, we wanted event handlers to deal with clicking, and then on this one we want a click as well, and then this one we want input, but we've got input on everything. Sometimes you do want multiple event handlers on an element, so it actually, yeah, is both a pro and a con. They're kind of simpler to understand, I think, but add event listener and remove event listener are, I'd say they're generally, I'm pretty sure they're more widely used. I think, when was add event listener? Add event listener. Let's see when this was added. So on the MDN documentation, if you scroll all the way down to a page about a feature, you get this nice little compatibility table. So form with options object supported. Don't know why you'd have options, form with options, okay, whatever. In Chrome, add event listener version 1, okay, that's been around for a very long time. And then on click, is that going to work? No. On click. Global event handlers on click. Maybe. Also version 1. So, okay, they're it seems like one is not newer or older than the other one. However, it does seem that add event listener has had additional functionality added to it at a later date. So Chrome 73, I don't know what we're on now, but it looks like there's an options object that we can pass to add event listener, and there's a passive option. It's false to true for wheel and mouse wheel events. Passive versus active. Passive false. I don't really see the point of that. But it's generally more common to use add event listener and remove event listener, but it's pretty useful to know if you're kind of being lazy. I don't think there's any necessarily reason why I avoid using on. I think it's just so I can sort of remember add and remove event listener, this one way to do it. But I do tend to avoid using on functions, except when I'm being lazy and I can't be bothered to make a named function to add it and then remove it. So I just say element.onClick equals every single time, so it overwrites it every single time. But it's up to you. There's not really a right way or wrong way, I don't think. Okay, that is events. So we started a bit late, but actually we're kind of on time now. So any questions generally on events, and if not, then I'll try to just chuck in a bunch of events and do some stuff on that page. So if anyone's got any suggestions, I'll probably do something horrible, like when you scroll, change the background color of the page to, and then it like flashes and looks awful. So if anyone's got anything slightly more interesting, we could change it gradually based on the mouse position. That would be interesting. Yeah, that would be interesting actually. Let's do that. Daniel says no, but I think you're referring to the like horrible flashy background, not the gradual mouse position version, which actually I think would be quite nice. So, tough. We're going to do that. So we have document add event listener mouse move. So anytime the mouse moves, we're going to log out the event. Let's just go console. Every time it moves, so I'm not moving my mouse now, no events are firing. As soon as I start moving, it's firing. I don't necessarily think it's like 60 times a second, but it's a lot of events are triggering. We also, I think there is X and Y. Yeah, there is X and Y. There's also page X and page Y, and movement X and movement Y, offset X, layer X, and client X. I just guess. I guess, and then you might as well just use X and Y, but then if it turns out it's actually different, then I usually go for client X and client Y, and then screen. It's a bit nuts as to why there are so many. But here we have the coordinates. So in computers, so when you're at school, you learnt that 0, 0 was the bottom left, but computers, if you didn't already know, they refer to the top left as 0, 0. So if you want to increase if you want to move something down, you increase the Y coordinate. So up here it's 0, 0, down here it's 7, 2, 2, 8, 1, 2. So let's say document dot body dot style dot background equals, and then we do a little RGB thing. Let's do, so we want 3 values, RGB for B, let's just do 255. So these values are from 0 to 255. So event, let's just see what happens when we just do event X and event Y. I don't think that's going to be quite what I want, but it kind of if I move down, it's going to increase the RG, the green value, and then I move right, and it's going to move the are the red value, and because we've set blue RGB to 255, it's always going to be white when we kind of move to the bottom right. Is there any other way we could do it? Event Y, X, Y. Let's just do something in the middle a little bit. So it's kind of yellow. If you go up there, there's lots of red but no green, and then green but no red. But if we want to do it the whole width, because it kind of stops at 255, we could. So window dot width, inner width, window dot inner height. So event x divided by window dot inner width, event y divided by window dot inner height. And we want to take that and multiply it by 255. Love a bit of maths, as long as it's easy. So now all the way across there it becomes 255, whereas previously it was like stopping about here, and now it's a completely the x and y coordinates of the colours are filling the entire page. So that looks much nice. It's still kind of slightly unpleasant, but it's much nicer than what I normally do. So that's some slightly funky thing that you can do. That's I hope you can kind of imagine how the scrolling might work, how that bar at the top. You could quickly try and implement that. That would be fun, or not if it doesn't work. Anyone else got any other suggestions? Daniel, was that as unpleasant as you were expecting, or did that turn out better?
It actually wasn't that bad.
See, it was lovely. Anyone else got any other suggestions? Otherwise, I'll try and do a scroll bar at the top, but I already said I don't like them. Yeah, I think it's going to be too much faff. Okay, let's do it anyway. So, got this. So we're going to have a class of scroll bar with a width of, let's just set the width to, whoops, whoops, sorry, wrong, I refreshed the wrong page.
You're muted. You're muted.
Oh, I'm muted as well. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, I refreshed the wrong page. That's pretty bad that it just like kicks you out immediately. Okay. Now what am I doing? Okay, so I've added a scroll bar at the top there with a width of 200. Let's add a bit of style. So scroll bar background blue, position absolute, top 0, left 0, height 1 EM. Is that going to work? Why is that not working? Does width have to be? Does width have to be in pixels? No. Width here has to be in pixels, 200 pixels. Oops. Okay, we're back. Width. Why isn't this working? Position absolute. Scroll bar top left. Height. Width. Width? What? Chuck important. Lucille will tell me off for doing that. There we go. Done. Okay. So, we have some style here, and then this width, this is going to change based on the scroll position. So when the user scrolls, document.add event listener scroll, we want to log out the event. And let's not log out the mouse X and Y. You might think that we have the scroll position in this event, but the scroll position is pretty easy to get to anyway, so I would think that's the reason they're not including the value inside this event object. It's just a generic event rather than specifically a scroll event, whereas moving the mouse, you can only find out where the mouse is if an event occurs. It's a bit weird, but we can have window.scroll y. That gives us the current y scroll position. So window.scroll y. We log that out every time. We should see this value increasing. We get body document.body.height inner height or height scroll height. So maths, this is going to be too difficult. Body scroll height is 7,250. So body height is document.body.scroll height. Current scroll is window.scroll y. I need to see this maths. Current scroll divided by body height. So all the way down here, I mean it's close enough, but it's because the screen window.inner height, it's actually because of that, so let's do body height minus window.inner height. So now it should be 0 at the top, and then 1 when we get to the bottom. There we go. There's 1, and we did start at 0. So now we get, it's like a percentage, percent scroll equals current scroll divided by body height. Then we can scroll bar document query selector scroll bar. Then we can set scroll bar dot style dot width. Something doesn't seem right. I think we can just use a percentage. Percent scroll times 100%. So the percent scroll is from 0 to 1. So we multiply that by 100 to get 0 to 100, which is going to be the percentage. And then we need to set the width to a string that contains the number and then the percent sign. So that's why we put it in the backticks with our percent. Let's see if that works. No. What's going on? I've got a lot of errors in here. What? Set. Okay, that's all stuff that I think is not they're not my errors, they're from the script that's included. So let's have a look at the scroll bar. width 0%. Okay, so that is actually working. It's because I still have width 200 on here. What if we do important, like the seal doesn't like? Important. Still, I knew this wouldn't work. Still doesn't like it. Why width auto important? Where is that coming from then? Find, okay, width auto important, no. Okay. And I think I don't want it to be absolute, I want it to be sticky. There we go. Oh, it looks actually better than I expected, sort of, coming out from the middle like that. I think I prefer it. It's not the full width of the page, but we can do that by doing viewport width VW. That is a percentage of the scroll bar position sticky. VW is a percentage of the viewport width. So instead of using percentage, which is actually referring to the parent, VW is referring to percentage of the entire viewport, which is sometimes pretty useful. And we want Z index of 100 just to put it in front of everything. Good, there, I've built. It's probably not the best thing to do because I think you can probably do it with some funky CSS that makes it a bit smoother, but it looks all right to me. Okay, that's 20 past. I've killed enough time. I feel like someone's left. Someone didn't enjoy me struggling to make that scroll bar.